Hello, everybody, and welcome to this webinar of BPIE about our latest publication, which is a guide for member states, for stakeholders, for civil society from many different regions, countries in Europe, how to deliver the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive and how to ensure that Europe will have better, affordable, and more resilient buildings for all its citizens. My name is Oliver Rapf. I'm the Executive Director of BPIE, and I will be joined shortly by our presenter and by a number of panelists. And I'm very much looking forward to moderating this event today for you in the next 90 minutes. Before we go into the details of the content, I would like just to make a few points on housekeeping. First, I would like to inform you that this event is being recorded, and the event recording will be shared afterwards. I also want to invite you to put any questions you may have into the Q&A box, which you should normally find at the bottom of your screen. If you hover your mouse of your computer towards the bottom of the screen, there should be a field called Q&A. We're going to monitor that in particular for the session after the first presentation to take any questions you may have. There will be no option to open the microphone, so please, any questions, put them in the chat box. I would also introduce very briefly the agenda to you. First of all, we're going to have a presentation about the guide itself, about the topics we cover, about the sections we have. Then we will have about 15 minutes for a Q&A session, and then we will have round about 45 minutes where different panelists will join us, who I will introduce later when we have reached that moment in time. The guide which we are going to present today is available on our website, and we should see the slide with the direct link to the report in a moment. And if not, we will definitely show it again afterwards. And then, yes, thank you very much. You have it already in the chat, the direct URL link to the guide where you can find it and download it. And with that, I would already like to hand over the floor to my colleague, Hélène Sibileau, who will run us through the guide. Hélène is the lead author of the report. She led the whole project. She did much of the research, coordinated the whole process. But the report, of course, benefits from the combined knowledge and analysis of the BPIE team and of the many reports and findings which we published in the past years. Hélène, thank you very much for joining us this morning. And I'll hand the floor over to you. You will guide us through the document. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Oliver, and good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to indeed guide you through the guide, if I may do the joke. Basically, I will unpack the about 200-page document. Starting with the next slide, basically, the structure of the presentation will be threefold. If you can go to the next slide, I will start with basically recalling why we have put together this guide on EPBD implementation, what's our approach to it, then go a bit more into the details of the content and present you what you can find in our guide to EPBD implementation, and finish with maybe a bit more political reflections, what to take away in the process of transposition and implementation. So let's start in the next slide with the logic of why putting together a guide on EPBD implementation. The first thing to recall, of course, is that it's basic, but implementing, transposing the EPBD is necessary. It's a legal requirement. And we are today actually 12 months before the transposition deadline of the directive in the member states. It's also necessary, not only from a legal point of view, but if we look at the challenges that we are facing in Europe at the moment, we are not only facing geopolitical turmoil, we have been seeing in the last years an energy and then turned into a cost of living crisis for Europeans. But of course, we'll still have to face this major threat of climate change, and we see a lack of sufficient progress in terms of building decarbonization. Second, the EPBD implementation is actually also something that is really desirable. It should not only be seen as a legal requirement, but as something positive, a huge opportunity to transform the lives of citizens and to reap benefits for businesses. We know the benefits of building renovation and decarbonization, not only for people, for their well-being, for ensuring social fairness, reducing energy poverty, basically achieving healthier lives. But it's also key, especially now, to achieving energy security, sovereignty for Europe, strengthening our economy, boosting the competitiveness of the construction and renovation industry, and of course to reduce emissions from an energy using sector, the building sector, and improving their climate resilience towards the future. And third, our logic for this guide was to really make the EPBD transposition and implementation simpler. As Oliver said in the introduction, our target audiences is primarily policymakers active at national level and also at regional and local level, but also stakeholders that participate, that implement, that help, and then that support that process. The objectives for this guide is to bring clarity. Of course, the text, it's a legal text from the EU level. It can be seen as something complex, so we wanted to bring clarity. And with that, we wanted to support a transposition that is faster, that is easier, that shares knowledge and also good practices, so that in the end, we increase the impact on the ground for people and businesses. In the next slide, I would like to present our approach. What was really important for BPIE was to adopt a holistic implementation framework. What does it mean? Basically, we wanted to recall that to do a good transposition and implementation, member states and anyone involved should avoid looking at the EPBD in a siloed approach, because provisions basically interact with each other. Sometimes they overlap, sometimes there are synergies, and this is really important to identify. Second point as well is to recall that there are mandatory requirements, obligations, but the supportive framework around it is as important as obligations. Apart from that, and not exclusively, but we try to focus on showing the most impactful provisions or design options. When I say impactful, this is not only for the building sector, but also for society, because the EPBD has really social fairness at its core. And so looking at how to approach transposition and implementation, we wanted to really showcase how to approach design options for policies to make the biggest impact. Finally, we also wanted to highlight that there is some national flexibility in implementation. The EPBD is a directive, so it offers a framework, and sometimes you have many options to choose from as a member state to implement. On one side, it is a good thing because it enables member states to basically tailor measures to the national context. At the same time, it can also be a bit negative, let's say, because you then need to assess different options and decide which one is the best for you. So in this sense, the guide also tries to help, outlining many options to choose from and explaining which one might be the best depending on the context. So Next slide. What is actually included in the guide? Our approach was to put provisions together in themes, starting with planning tools to achieve the 2050 vision for the built environment with national building renovation plans. Second, focusing on the renovation of existing buildings with the new measures introduced. Third, looking at the updated standard for construction, as well as the progressive integration of life cycle thinking, which is a new thing in this EPBD revision. And finishing with the strong supportive framework, looking at information, but also advisory services and financial support. In the next slide, I actually explain a bit more how we see these 4 themes in a system. So if you go to the next slide, you will see in a few seconds how we actually see and portray the Buildings Directive as a system. So starting with the strategic vision, we have the NBRP. Following from that, you have your policies and measures, both on the existing buildings and the new buildings side, underpinned by the supportive framework where we have energy performance certificates, renovation passports, one-stop shops, and financial support. But if you go to the next slide, you will see that actually this is not all. And we propose even more content to dive into. If you want to look at the EPBD in a more thematic approach, we wanted to look at some topics that are across the directive, notably the leading role of public buildings, the update of the cost optimal methodology, which is a technical topic, but key to unlock change. And then we also wanted to look at more forward-looking approaches, for example, how to empower a building sector to provide flexibility to the electricity grids, adaptation of buildings to climate risks, and finally, indoor environmental quality and healthier buildings. In the next slide, I wanted to highlight also that we have extracted all of the deadlines that are throughout the directive and try to put some nice visual timelines that would help you basically look at the next decades and see what are the milestones and the deadlines for the different provisions, be it for the different segments, for new or for existing buildings. And in the next slide, again, some parts that I want to draw your attention to. The EPBD guide that BPIE put together, of course, is presenting the most impactful and important provisions of the directive. It basically describes them, it clarifies them in a bit of a less legal wording, and then outlines some policy options. But if you are really looking for specific inputs, I would draw your attention to these 4 parts. So we have definition boxes, which is really important to understand because the EPBD brought new concepts and it's very important to understand them. Of course, we have our BPIE recommendation boxes and we have more than 80 throughout the document. We also wanted to have something that is really palatable and concrete. So we have gathered around 60 good practice examples from projects, from countries, from regions all across Europe. And then finally, focus boxes that look at the interactions between the EPBD and other files of the Fit for 55 package, notably the Energy Efficiency Directive. So next slide. Moving on to basically what we say about all these different provisions. It's really hard to do a guide to the guide and packing more than 200 pages in a few minutes, but I will just give you the highlights so you can basically identify where you're most interested to look at based on our structure and table of content. So starting with the next slide, as I said, the first thing in terms of importance and also in terms of sequence would be to look at the planning tools to achieve the 2050 vision. The EPBD is now quite clear that by 2050, we need to achieve a zero emission building stock across Europe in every member state. But at the same time, we have a vision for society. As I said, strong social fairness considerations are included throughout the directive. And this road to 2050 is underpinned with intermediary milestones. You will see some very clear timelines that helps you visualize how to go to 2050. The tool actually to strategize and to go there is the National Building Renovation Plan, which is a strategic, really compass instrument to direct action. And here what we wanted to highlight is both the process and the content of the plans, what is expected from member states with the first draft by the end of December this year. So in the next slide, I highlighted basically in terms of content, the 5 pillars of what should be included in which sequence in the National Building Renovation Plans. And in terms of process, the guide is actually focusing quite a lot on how to draw a good process for drafting an NBRP, and especially looking at the public consultation, which is a key aspect of the drafting process. And in this, I would like to already highlight that we will run a survey amongst national stakeholders during the summer to actually do a reality check on how the NBRP drafting process and especially the public consultations are going on in member states. So if you're interested and active on the topic, stay tuned for our communications channel or let us know. We'll be happy to get your input. Moving on to the next slide, as I said, we focus quite a bit of the guide on the new measures that target the renovation of existing buildings. And here we decided to do it segment by segment, as this is the approach of the EPBD. So minimum energy performance standards for non-residential buildings and the national trajectories for the progressive renovation of the residential stock. With a deep dive on the leading role of public buildings. And here what we've done is outlining a roadmap, basically step-by-step approach, how member states can design those policies, starting with the identification of the buildings that are under the scope based on quality data, how to set the right ambition levels, establishing the trajectories, deciding basically how to design optimal policy packages, obligations, financial support, and information. And at the same time, already looking at how to deliver that and designing a fair and effective governance system to ensure compliance. In the next slide, we then, in the guide, move on to the standard that applies to construction, so the zero emission building standards. And here again, we look at the energy performance, basically how the new thresholds for energy performance for these buildings shall be set. So these are would be applied to new buildings as of 2030. And we also look at the energy sources which are eligible to supply a zero emission buildings, how to optimize the different options. There are 4 eligible options, when to use alternatives and under which conditions. And in that, we look at the recalibration of the cost optimal methodology. In the next slide, you will see that based from there, we then move on to more forward-looking approaches. As I said, we look at the interactions between buildings and the electricity grids with this flexibility approach. We look at adaptation and climate resilience of buildings, and we also outline a roadmap on how to approach the EPBD measures linked to life cycle thinking, since the EPBD proposes an incremental approach starting from disclosure to then setting limit values. Next slide, the guide then touches upon the supportive framework. We chose to start from the information tools that is basically existing for a very long time, energy performance certificates, which have seen a big reform in this EPBD revision. And here we outline and we show how they can be made more readable, how can they be rescaled, how to improve their content, both indicators and recommendations, and then how to increase their numbers, but also how to increase their quality. Then moving on to the new framework, to facilitate the uptake of renovation passports. This is a new thing in the EPBD. So basically, we outline what is a renovation passport, how it should look like, how it should be designed and issued, and then which are the responsibilities to roll out renovation passports between member states, if they choose to make them mandatory or optional for building owners, basically what are different options and how to incentivize their take-up. And we also have a deep dive here on indoor environmental quality in healthy buildings, because this section of the guide is really looking at how to make renovation palatable and easy to citizens. So it made sense to highlight this benefit here of renovation. And the last part of the supportive framework looks at the stronger role given by the EPBD to one-stop shops. Basically, again, explaining what they are and the sequence of rolling them out, starting with deciding on the target audience, the services that they should provide, who is responsible for establishing them, rolling out, to manage how to manage them and sustain what are, for example, business models to sustain a network of one-stop shops. And we finish with a key component, of course, of the EPBD, financial support for building renovation and decarbonization, explaining the diverse financing instruments that the EPBD proposes to member states. And then we outlined some key quality principles to optimize the use of funding, especially public funding, finishing with the social consideration and how to make sure that financial support reaches the most vulnerable and those who need it the most. So if you go to the next slide, I will finish with some key messages coming from, as you have seen, a very long list of provisions that are described, where you have suggestions on how to implement it, as well as good practices. But if we take a step back and look at basically how to approach transposition and implementation, I wanted to highlight here a few perspectives. The first one is a quote that I really like, is that nothing is actually more deceiving than unfulfilled promises. With the new EPBD, we have really good provisions at EU level in the legal text, but the success and also the impact on the ground now really depends on the effective transposition and implementation of the text and the new provisions. In the current context, especially where we have a convergence of multiple crises, moving these provisions from paper to reality is even more crucial than ever. And if we do that effectively, as I said again, always paying attention to social fairness considerations, the EPBD really has potential to drive positive and major transformation for both the building sector and society. But to do all of that, of course, we need sound planning, we need expertise, we need collective knowledge, we need to do good design options. But above all, I would like to highlight that this is a collective action. And of course, member states are in the driving seat, but also stakeholders must now act really decisively in that process. And we hope that this guide will pay a contribution. And we hope to propose something to you that is a practical tool, but it's also a call to action to use it yourself, but also to share it and to promote it to everyone that works on building renovation and decarbonization, with the ultimate goal, of course, to turn policy into action and then into results for people and for businesses on the ground. And if I may just finish with one quote, just to give a bit of a hope and enthusiasm to act. This one I really like is: the secret of getting ahead is getting started. And with that, I hand over back to Oliver for the Q&A and then for the panel. Really looking forward to hear from people that are actually active on the ground at national and at local level. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to you, Hélène, for this first overview about all the dense and rich information we have in the guide. Now, before we go into the Q&A session, we actually want to ask you in the audience just one question. And for that, we have prepared a short poll, which I hope we can show on the screen. Yes, so basically the question we would like you to answer is, in your opinion, which one of the following provisions of the new EPBD has the most potential to drive meaningful change? You can make only one choice out of the ones you see on the screen. So which of these measures, which of these provisions do you think will have the most impact in driving change in national building and construction and renovation activities? Is it national building renovation plans? Is it the introduction of minimum energy performance standards for non-residential buildings? The renovation trajectories for the residential building segment, or maybe the zero emission building standard for new constructions, the newly introduced whole life carbon requirements, maybe the reform of the energy performance certificates, or the introduction of the renovation passports and one-stop shops. So please make your choice, make your vote right now, and then we'll see what you are thinking. And we will probably not get a live overview of the results, but we should have them in a moment. So just click on one of them, and then we should get the results. I know it can be a hard choice, especially if you have to decide between focusing on new buildings versus focusing on the renovation of buildings. Of course, looking at the life cycle analysis of the climate impact of buildings is also very important. But I just wanted to basically give you an idea of where we stand. And I now have received a result, but I'm not sure whether we can show this on the screen or not. Michaela, if we can show this on the screen, it would be wonderful. I can tell you already what the result looks like. Here we have it. Okay. I think we have a clear winner, if we can say so. About a quarter of you are putting national building renovation plans as the biggest driver for change. Second place are renovation passports and one-stop shops. And in third place, so to speak, are the renovation trajectories for the residential segment. So it's very interesting that a clear majority of you thinks that the provisions for renovating buildings are the most important ones to drive change. The zero emission building standard for new constructions got only 8%, obviously still important, but there is a clear majority which is focusing on the measures to support renovation. And the reform of the energy performance certificates actually seems to have been considered the least important of all these choices. So thank you very much for this initial feedback. And we have a number of questions which I would like to ask Hélène. Hélène, the first question is about minimum energy performance standards. Are these minimum energy performance standards based on EPCs in the future, or are they going to ask for percentage of energy savings? Is there a clear difference? Is the EPBD clear on that? And what can we say about that?
Yes, thank you for the question and the opportunity actually to clarify. Indeed, with a sort of short overview, it's difficult to go into all the details. So for the minimum energy performance standards, the first thing is that in the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, from the EU level, they apply to non-residential buildings. On the other side, the EPBD leaves the choice to member states if they want to also introduce MEPs for the residential segment if they want to do so. But there are no specific design options for the residential segment that come from the EU level. Now, on the non-residential building segment, what the EPBD requires member states to do is to identify 2 tranches of their worst performing non-residential buildings. So first the 16% worst performing buildings, and then adding a 10 percentage point tranche. So overall the 16 and then the 26% worst performing non-residential buildings, which then have to be renovated by 2030 and 33 to basically, I would say, leave that worst performing tranche. The EPBD does not require those worst performing non-residential building to achieve a certain performance level apart from going out of this tranche. Of course, at BPIE, we say it makes more sense to go for a deeper renovation immediately. That's for the ambition level. And then the second part of the question was with the link with the EPCs. And the way that the EPBD for non-residential buildings maps makes the link between the obligation and the EPCs is that the identification of buildings is based on either primary energy use or final energy use in kilowatt hour per square meter per year. That's enabling member states to identify their 16 and 26% worst performing buildings. And then they have the choice, if it makes sense, for communication purposes to building owners, for the industry, to express these 2 tranches into EPCs. But it's not the EPCs that first determine the buildings that are to be renovated. It's basically a calculation based on an overview of the building stock. But EPCs serve as a communication tool, if it makes sense, to the public.
Thank you, Hélène. We get a number of questions here in the Q&A, and some of them are asking us to explain why something is in the EPBD or not, or how it is covered. That's maybe something we cannot directly answer, but nevertheless, I'd like to raise that point to you, Hélène. And one of these questions is, as obviously the current building stock which exists will still be standing in many decades, why is there not more focus on the advantage of embodied carbon in existing buildings versus embodied carbon in new buildings, which still have to be erected? That's a bit of an interpretation and maybe a bit of a question about the negotiations, but what would be your response to that?
Yes, indeed, that's a good point from the participant. And the EPBD actually indeed looks at embodied carbon, whole life carbon requirements specifically for new build and not for existing buildings being renovated. I would say maybe the reason why we have this, and Oliver, you recalled it, like looking back at the negotiation, is probably because embodied carbon, whole life carbon requirements are something really new at EU level. And it made more sense at this point to introduce the first requirements for new build, starting with an incremental approach, which is to collect data, to design a roadmap, and then to set limit values as a second step. And it also made more sense maybe to start with new builds for practical reasons, with collecting data, which might be easier, and setting limit values in connection to the updated standard, the zero emission building standard, so that everything is just made easier for a rollout in the next few years. But indeed, I would say moving these requirements to existing buildings would be the next step, whether it is done at national level. Some member states are front runners and have actually implemented whole life carbon requirements even before the EPBD provisions. So they may well inform others about how to do it for existing buildings. And this is actually some of the BPIE recommendations in the guide, is that you have some renovation advice tools, such as the renovation passport. And if member states feel like it and have maybe sufficient experience either in the member states or from others, to actually gradually include these requirements and this information gathering into, for example, renovation passport. So I hope it gives a bit of a context why whole life carbon embodied emissions focus on new build at EU level first. But of course, I would agree that there is much to do in the future or at national level already on existing buildings with some of the existing tools, actually.
Thank you, Hélène. And then I have a question here for you, which relates to the data or the lack of adequate data. What the plans are in the EPBD to maybe change that, because currently we cannot effectively monitor the impacts of the EPBD implementation. And there seems to be a lot of reliance on energy performance certificates, but we know that in many markets in Europe, the energy performance certificate databases cover only a small fraction of the building stock and therefore are not really reliable as a data source. Is the EPBD making any reference to maybe introducing sample-based statistical surveys, something as is done in the UK English Housing Survey? What's your reading and understanding of these data-related provisions in the EPBD?
Yeah, very good question as well, indeed. I would say that this EPBD revision with the provisions introduced, so either the totally new provisions or the improvement to current provisions introduced, I would really see this as an EPBD revision that really makes the link between data gathering, collection, management of data, and policy design. And it's really important to see indeed that we need more data and we need more quality data to design those policy options. At the same time, this EPBD revision also, having that in mind, recognize that we need to introduce some measures, some provisions to collect more data, to do it in a more coordinated and consistent way. And it recognized that with notably the Article 22, looking at the energy performance database for buildings, which should actually at national level gather all the available information, not only from the EPCs, but also connecting it with other information tools, which are, for example, the renovation passports, the digital building logbooks, the cadastre, the other databases that might be relevant for buildings. And then also the EPBD now requires that these databases, they would also feed into the EU level database, which is the Building Stock Observatory, which is up and running on DG Energy's website, which is, a mine, like a gold mine of information, that there should be regular updates, quality control on the data that is put there. And ultimately, the idea is to continue that, to have a regular update both at national and at EU level. And just a point more specifically, there was a detailed part of the question on statistical sampling. Just to let the participant know that in several of the provisions, for example, linked to renovation requirements, the EPBD really recognizes that indeed, when member states have to first draw an overview of their, for example, residential stock or of their worst performing non-residential buildings, the EPBD recognizes that indeed the EPC is maybe the go-to tool, that of course member states should have had their EPC database for a long time, but it also recognizes that there are some other ways to collect data. Statistical sampling is one. So it's also really open, and as I said in my presentation, flexible on how to do things. And the idea is really to collect as much as possible, control the quality, cross-check sources, and input that into both the policy design options and into the database, both at EU and then at national level with the BSO.
Thank you, Hélène, for this very comprehensive answer. I have a question which is a little bit similar and connected. The EPBD introduces the concept of zero emission building stock. Is it clearly defined where the boundaries are for this definition? Does it include direct, indirect, embodied greenhouse gas emissions? How clear is the EPBD about that?
Yes, so I would start by saying that you have actually different levels. The first level is indeed the 2050 vision for the zero emission building stock. And that should really be understood as something that looks at the entire stock of both residential, non-residential, and public buildings with an average approach. So it doesn't mean the EPBD does not require so far to have all existing buildings to be transformed to zero emission building standard by 2050. That's not what is required. So we know that some will need to be deeply renovated, some will be actually energy positive buildings, we'll have some new buildings constructed, and all of that should lead to a zero emission building stock by 2050. In terms of the ZEB at individual level, it really looks at the emissions, and what it says is that the ZEB should really have a very high energy performance. So the thresholds actually of a ZEB as of 2030 should be better than the ones that we currently have for nearly zero energy buildings. So there is still an improvement in the reduction of energy demand there. And then it also looks at emissions. And indeed, there is maybe a shift here between the NZEB, which clearly only mentioned in its definition renewable energy sources, and the ZEB standards, which looks a bit more broadly at emissions. And here it mentions 4 eligible options to as energy sources to supply a ZEB. So we have renewables on site or nearby, we have a renewable energy community, we have carbon-free sources, but we can also have the efficient district heating and cooling system. So of course, with those 4 options, as well as the alternatives, I won't go into the details. This means that we look at emissions that occur directly into the building, but also the ones that occur because the building would basically draw its energy sources from either the grid, the district heating and cooling system, or something a bit broader. And again, for new buildings, the embodied carbon provisions. Of course, we also look a bit more broadly, not only at the use phase of the building, but also the construction and other stages. So indeed, the PPD now looks a bit more broadly and frames a bit more the different stages and the different locations of energy use.
Thanks, Hélène. We exhausted the time allocated to the Q&A session, but we have so many. I would like to just give you 2 shorter ones and would like to ask you for 2 short answers. The first one is, what are the provisions to decarbonize the heating and potentially also the electricity sector? Because as one participant says, this might be quicker fixes to decarbonize the building sector.
So in terms of decarbonizing heating and cooling, I would say one that is actually already in place before the transposition deadline as of the 1st of January this year. Member states are not allowed anymore to give financial support, so public subsidies to the replacement to standalone fossil fuel boilers. So that is sort of correcting the financing between fossil fuels and renewable options. And then there is also in the national building renovation plans an indicative target in 2040 to have fully decarbonized heating and cooling, especially looking at elimination of fossil fuel boilers. That's a bit more indicative, and more flexibility given to member states to set requirements on heating and cooling generators. But again, this is where flexibility comes in, and the EPBD gives that option to member states, but maybe this is where the obligations are a bit less stringent to move from fossil fuel to renewables, although there are a lot of incentives and calls in the EPBD for member states to do that.
Thank you. And then, yes,
yeah,
sorry. And a final question on the global warming potential and the overall topic of whole life carbon. How specific is the EPBD in terms of prescribing how global warming potential should be calculated? What are we expecting there?
I must admit, I am not a whole life carbon requirement specialist. What I know is that the EPBD, and for those who might not be familiar with how EU level regulation legislation works, we have the EPBD, but there are a lot of still secondary, what we call secondary legislation that will come in, that will specify and give more details on some parts of the EPBD. One is, and that's called delegated acts. One is coming on the cost optimal methodology, and one is actually coming on whole life carbon, specifically with the methodology that is expected from the Commission by the end of December this year. And I would prefer to remain more general by saying that the EU level with its upcoming methodology will give some framework, and I think it's still important to look as much as possible as a member states to use this one, to use a harmonized as much as possible approach, because this would facilitate transposition and implementation down the line. But on some other aspects, there are a bit more flexibility and a bit more leeway given to member states. So I wouldn't say it's a black and white answer. It depends exactly what you're looking for. But I would say the main point is that watch out for the delegated act, and really looking at the EU methodology to make sure that it's also easier and simpler for the member states that have so far little experience in those provisions.
Thank you very much, Hélène, for making this point clear. So we have the EPBD in its final text as published in the official journal, but we will have more regulation coming in the form of delegated acts, clarifying some of the questions which may still be open from the text. Hélène, clearly you know the EPBD by heart. You probably also know our guide by heart. I would just like to point again to the message in the chat box where you can all find the URL to the publication itself available on BPIE's website. And in the coming months, we will, of course, not stop working on this issue, how to best implement the EPBD. We will publish some other papers, forthcoming papers. We will run webinars in the coming months. We will do little video trainings and so on. So you can expect more from us on that matter. Thank you very much, Hélène, for your time and all the answers you have provided. And I would now like to move to the panel discussion, because the big question, of course, is what do stakeholders who have to really implement and will implement the provisions from the EPBD, what do they think how the collective action should look like? And what roles do they foresee for themselves, for their constituency? And we have 4 panelists, which you can now see here on the screen. Thank you very much for joining us today. We have Gyorgy, who's the Associate Director for Policy and Advocacy for Habitat for Humanity. We have Irene Skoula, who is the Director for Energy and Buildings in the C40 Cities Network. We have Aleksandra Stępniak, who is the Chairwoman of the Polish Renovation Wave Association. And we have Sofia Cederlöf, who is a Senior Sustainability Specialist at SEB, the Scandinavian bank. So thank you very much for joining us today. I hope you're all visible on the screen. And Gyorgy, I would like to start with a first question to you. The EPBD for the first time introduces aspects about social fairness, introduces specific requirements to tackle energy poverty. Your organization is an NGO running many projects, working on the ground in many, many member states. What do you see as the main benefits, but also as the main challenges of having these new provisions in the EPBD with respect to the EPBD implementation?
Thank you, Oliver, and thanks for the invitation. I believe that I would say two things from the EPBD which are very relevant for our work. We are trying to help renovating owner-occupied multi-apartment buildings in Central and Eastern Europe. That's our focus. And it's super important that the EPBD now recognizes these structures. They use the language co-ownership structures. And in Articles 17 and 18, this term is mentioned a couple of times when it comes to better regulation or give financing. And also, I think it's very important to acknowledge that a lot of people who are energy poor live as owners in these co-ownership structures or multi-apartment buildings. And we should try to scale up the renovation to help those people. The other element of the EPBD I would mention is regarding one-stop shops. When the EPBD talks about one-stop shops for the most vulnerable, it talks about giving a holistic support for vulnerable groups. And we advocated a lot during the EPBD recast process that the technical assistance one-stop shops are giving shouldn't be focusing only on strictly speaking technical issues like project design and financing, but also in the case of multi-apartment buildings, social facilitation, awareness raising. So it's a lot of social skills to convince the community, to help the community to make decisions, and help the community to implement renovation projects of multi-apartment buildings.
Thank you very much for clarifying that. What you see is very important. Irene, you're working with many, many cities in Europe, and cities are obviously the places where the renovations are going to happen. What role do you see for the cities in advancing that? Maybe also in connection to what Gyorgy just mentioned, the one-stop shops, the social facilitation.
Thanks, Oliver, and thanks for the invitation. And congratulations, Hélène, on your knowledge of the EPBD in such detail. I'm always impressed. I think that cities are quite welcoming the update of the legislation of the EPBD and all legislation under the Fit for 55 package. And I think they're ready and very committed to put their experience and in practice to help accelerate building retrofits, renewables uptake, and good green jobs delivery in the EU. As you said, Oliver, there are many elements in the directive that, if you read them in a bit more holistic way, they're actually addressed to the local or subnational level governments. The building renovation plans, the local heating and cooling decarbonization plans, the minimum energy performance standards, the renovation of public buildings, which is crucial, as you know, a leadership point, and addressing, as we said, energy poverty and one-stop shops that need to be created. Many of these things have an element at the local level. So I believe the role of cities in actually implementing the EPBD is crucial. And I think that member states need to ensure that the local level, subnational governments are actually actively involved in the implementation, are actively consulted, and that they provide input into the national policies and implementation plans. We heard just before about the vulnerable households, the one-stop shops. in the national building renovation plans, which we also saw in the poll, it's one of the most important measures of the new EPBD. We need to identify vulnerable households. Who is better placed than cities that are the closest level of government to help this identification? We also know that many cities in Europe, in the EU, like Barcelona, Paris, and a few other member cities we have, they're actively involved in supporting vulnerable households to this transition, giving them advice, energy advice to address energy poverty, retrofit their homes, not deep retrofit necessarily, but retrofit the homes and save from the energy bills. And I would like to stress out that the EPBD implementation, the EPBD in general, and the legislation around buildings should be seen mostly under the social aspect, because it helps tackle multiple problems at the same time. Yes, it's a climate crisis, very important, of course, but it also helps the social crisis, the housing crisis, energy poverty, and so on. So it shouldn't be seen in isolation. And the fact that it focuses so much on the social aspect, for us, is a clear win and a clear movement ahead. Another very important thing I would like to stress out very quickly is that cities can also help, and local governments in general, with the misinformation or sometimes disinformation that is being circulated around the EPBD. I don't know how many stories you know, I'm sure you know many, but there have been serious, media broadcasts and news around the EPBD about, we will take you back home, or you will need to pay for the retrofits. I'm sure this is not, we all agree that obviously that is not the purpose of the directive, but local governments can help fight this. People are scared. They're facing day-to-day crisis, right? Mm-hmm. So they need to be supported and ensured by their local governments at first, but also by their local governments to implement the measures of the EPBD.
Irene, one quick additional question. You mentioned that governments should consult cities. Now we're in the middle, actually, of the transposition period at the moment. Do you know of any examples where a member state government is actively consulting cities, municipalities at this very moment?
I know I can speak for Greece at the moment. There are some discussions between the capital city, Athens, and the national government around the EPBD, but I would say it's not at the level they should be. However, I would like to mention, and I don't know if you have heard, that there is this initiative of Mayors for Housing, which is mostly focused on the housing affordability aspect of the building and housing crisis in Europe, and a delegation of 40 mayors met with the European Commission recently. Yes, mayors are trying to position themselves and cities as, at the center of this discussion between EU institutions and member states. Obviously, EU institutions cannot dictate to member states how they will implement the directive. There is some freedom, obviously, into this. But I think Athens, I think also Barcelona and our Spanish cities are in contact with the national government around the national building renovation plans. But this needs to happen as a mainstream, right?
Yes.
Not as one example that we can see in a few countries.
Thank you very much, Irene. Aleksandra, you're chairwoman of, in its English translation, the Polish Renovation Wave Association. It's a private sector initiative. What are you, as a private sector initiative, as a group of companies, what are you doing to collaborate with the government in Poland to make that dialogue happen? Is it happening in Poland? What is the situation there?
Yes, of course. So for us, for Renovation Wave Association and all of our company, this implementation of EPBD is one of the crucial priorities for this year, and I think also for the next year. And we cooperate with our government on the different levels. So first of all, of course, we are attending all of the consultation process regarding the National Renovation Plan, the Energy Classes document, and many, many others. But also we have some direct meeting with them to discuss some, topic which are important for us and which we want to discuss them with them deeply. And third, and I think that this is really, really important to do something like this, we also deliver for them some figure, facts, comment, arguments, which could be helpful in this implementation process. Because maybe I needed to start from this. In Poland, EPBD transposition doesn't have a good PR. And it was used also for some political purpose. And there was this communication that if people do not make expensive modernization, they will move from their apartment, their house, and so on. So we are working to change this and to show that EPBD implementation is an opportunity, not a threat, and it will contribute to the significant positive changes. And Hélène mentioned that EPBD has potential to drive major transition in Europe built environment and social, and we also want to do it. And we prepared the report, the analysis, which show all of the economic, social, and environmental benefits from EPBD transposition. We created for our government, for them, that they could use it in their communication. We also prepare other documents which show how to effectively use energy classes in the renovation support programs. And we was based there on 3 types of buildings, so single family house, multi-family house, and public building, and and made the connection with existing support programs. And both of these reports we will show on our annual conference, which will take place next week in Warsaw, but also we show it on the governmental conference to make government, aware that there's a lot of facts, a lot of numbers, which can help them to communicate this EPBD transposition. And what is also important, we want to convince all government that EPBD implementation is topic not only for this one ministry, which is responsible for building sector, but also from others responsible for health, for finance, for labor market, energy transition for Poland. And it should be a cross-sector and a cross-resort topic.
Thank you very much, Aleksandra. Sofia, with your profession, you're sitting at a key position in making the building transition, the renovation happening. What do you think is the biggest role of banks in supporting the implementation of the EPBD?
Hi, Oliver, and thanks a lot, first off, for the invitation. And happy also to read up on your latest report. I think one of the key aspects here for all of our professions, not only from my profession in the banking industry, is that we see that the responsibilities are growing, not only from the financial side, but some sort of partnershiping with governments, industry, regulation, etc., just to make this happen. So first off, I see that the banks have a huge role in also partnering with other professions in order to get this going. But from the bank's perspective, I think on taking on the bigger role is that we have a big role in financing this transition through diverse sort of products, etc., so we can make it happen. But also one big aspect is that we face is that as some of the former speakers also has noted, is that we need to provide correct advisory to our lenders, most efficient to the SMEs, because the larger ones do have a lot of knowledge in this space, but to this sort of SME space, I would say. Of course, also interesting with EPCs and enhancing the data and supporting the governments, for example, with pushing on to get more and clearer data. Because we have connection in our advisory, we have connection to all our lenders, so we can also advise and also encourage to get this EPC up and running. But also on our face, on the other side, we can also align with taxonomy, for example, on the green product side, but as well as on the risk side, that we need to also see are we aligned? Do we have any risks? And where do we have risks? So we can address that as soon as possible. And as Hélène said, also if we have this sort of long phase in also advising our customers when we see the risk side, when we have this sort of long period, then we can also advocate for the one-stop shops, for example, or have a transition together with our customer to set up a plan for them.
Thank you, Sofia. Managing risk, of course, is essential for the financial service industry, no doubt about this. Gyorgy said at the very beginning that the importance of, well, providing opportunities for people with lower incomes is essential, right? Often people with lower incomes also own properties. How do you see that risk management aspect? Are there any approaches which you see the financial service industry thinking about or developing, which in particular target people with lower incomes, people suffering from energy poverty? Is that a market aspect where you think about even why it may come with a higher risk?
Of course, this is something that is, I think, for the financial institutions that is really high in mind, not only for like the real estate market, but also for other aspects. And there is a lot of like thinking, discussions, as well as some sort of private public schemes, for example, that can accommodate for this type of product that can be used in leveraging this.
Gyorgy, can I ask you, if you basically had a wish free to the financial institutions community to facilitate your work, the achievement of your objectives, what would it be? You're on mute. Sorry, please unmute your microphone.
Yes, I'm sorry. Yeah, I think there are good examples in Poland, Romania, Lithuania, where banks are giving loans to homeowner associations, where there is no collateral, but they use the cash flow of the homeowner association. And if the cash flow is healthy, then it's less risk to provide loans for renovation for these communities. For some reasons, in some countries it's working well, in some countries it's not. And I think the way it started in these countries, that first there was a guarantee fund coming from EBRD or some European institution, and that de-risked the whole thing to start. And then when the banks saw that it's not a risky business, then it scaled up. And I think this should be a solution for communities which are mixed and a lot of people are able to pay the loan. And this is, of course, not a good solution for the poorest or the most vulnerable.
Thank you. But you're saying if there are de-risking mechanisms in place, put in place essentially by the national governments, then the situation is significantly improving. Okay, thank you. Irene, the renovation of buildings, of course, has many additional benefits than only, in inverted commas, only reducing greenhouse gas emissions or only saving energy, only reducing energy bills. Do the cities evaluate, document other societal benefits which they see through programs? Is that an important driver for programs they may implement at their local level?
Very good question. Yes, I think they do. The societal aspects have two, let's say, elements that our cities are interested in. The one is, as we said, alleviating energy poverty and supporting the most vulnerable households in their, territory, in the local administration. We know the examples of the programs like the Energy Advisory Points of Barcelona or the Eco Renovon Paris, where they tried they actually retrofitted the most low-income households, help the retrofit of low-income households, and they have, evaluated the benefits in terms of energy cost reduction that was provided to these households. But there is another aspect which is also very important. It's the job creation. when you do retrofits, the retrofits are happening at the local level. So this creates a market, and this creates jobs that are local. They're not, you know, somewhere outside your country, your city, for the, you know, the production of a specific product. This as well, but the actual retrofit, the construction work, happens at your own territory. So this has a huge job creation potential. C40 studies have shown that the job creation potential from retrofits is the highest among all the other good green jobs that we can create with climate action, and it's local. So I think, and the third, I would say, it's also related with vulnerable, but not only, is the health improvement. We know that good insulated homes with proper heating or cooling, for us in the Mediterranean, can provide health benefits and reduce asthma if you avoid using, let's say, fossil fuel appliances, and avoid respiratory issues. And these health benefits also have a monetary value, right, for the national government. You reduce health costs and you reduce, you know, admissions to hospital and all that, you know, follows in the health supply chain. So I think, yes, our cities, I would say our cities are mostly interested in the societal aspects. And of course, the building renovations help their climate goals. But I think this social and competitiveness at the local level that it creates is of key importance.
Thank you very much, Irene. We talked a lot about renovation so far. I just would like to, for the last 2 minutes of the panel, just address the question of new buildings, the zero emission building standard. Aleksandra, I wanted to ask you, is that something the construction industry is ready for?
So from my point of view, yes, of course, because it is not rocket science what we need to bring with this zero emission building standard. It is just 10% below the level which is now of the EP when we talk about EP, and we know that this building should not emit any, you know, CO2 emission inside. So this is not a rocket science, and I think we are ready for it. But what I see here in Poland, a lot of people also from the building sector, they don't understand what does it mean, this zero emission standard. And they are thinking, this was this question in the first part of our webinar. And a lot of people think that we need to make it, you know, zero emission in all of the aspects. So also CO2 embedded and so on. So, and I think that what is crucial to proper EPBD implementation, and it is both in the renovated building, but also in the new building, we need to really increase the awareness around this document, around the goal of this document, and we need to show that all of this is really, you know, we are able to do it.
Okay. That's reassuring to hear that you're able to do it. Thank you so much, Aleksandra. Sofia, final question of this panel to you. Can we expect any specific financial products which make it easier for people to choose the zero emission buildings, maybe even ahead of any regulatory deadlines?
Sorry, Oliver, my network is really bad. Could you repeat the question, please?
Yes, my question is whether we can expect any financial products put on the market by banks which make it easier for people to choose zero emission building standards in new buildings, maybe even ahead of the regulatory deadlines?
I would say, at least for in Sweden, I think that there is no sort of need for a financial product for the buyer to understand that there is a zero emission building. So there is sort of total awareness of what will be a zero emission building after the policies, etc., has come into force. So no sort of need for a typical financial product, I would say, in this case.
Okay, thank you. It's good to hear that the awareness is already there and it's not dependent on additional specific financial products. Wonderful. I would like to thank all 4 of you for joining the panel discussion today. Thank you very much. For the final 15 minutes of this webinar, we want to have a look at what is really happening on the ground. And I'm very happy to welcome Rui Fragoso, who is from the Portuguese Energy Agency, where he is the head of buildings and efficiency of resources. And Rui, you will tell us what Portugal is already doing to implement the new EPBD and what kind of challenges you're facing and how you plan to overcome them. So we get a presentation really about policy action taking place right now. Rui, thank you very much for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Oliver, for this invitation. And it's a great pleasure for me to be here showing a little on what's happening in terms of the impact of the EPBD in Portugal. Thank you also to the BPIE for the report that has just been presented, also by Hélène. So it's very useful and detailed document that I'm pretty sure will help all the member states and for sure my colleagues here at ADENE. I think you might be already seeing my screen. So I'm going to go through 10 minutes to just give you a little glimpse of how we are actually implementing and supporting the EPBD. So the building sector is an important sector in Portugal, as in most of the EU member states. We have a large building stock, a big building stock made by mostly single-family houses, but in certain cases, houses that were built in the 80s, in the 90s, and so buildings that didn't have at that time much energy efficiency. We can see on the right side the energy performance of residential and non-residential. So we can see a lot of improvement that we can do on the residential. And we also can see that on non-residential, there's still a margin to progress in order to achieve a very efficient buildings. In terms of the energy and consumption and emissions, we can see that we have quite an important share of energy consumption in the building sector. So around 1/3 is actually consumed in buildings. But when we look at the gas emission, actually the building sector in Portugal is responsible only for a little over 5% if we took only in consideration scope 1 or 18% for scope 2. Also due to the fact that we have 2/3 of the energy consumed in buildings coming from renewables, and this actually lowers this number. We know that in certain cases, we might even need to increase a little energy consumption in certain situations, or we may have some energy poverty phenomenon. But nevertheless, in terms of emissions, I would say that we are quite good. Looking at the impacts arising from the EPBD implementation in the last almost 2 decades, I would like to raise 6 topics. On the energy performance, we have seen that buildings now are much more efficient compared to the buildings we had 20 and 30 years ago. We are much more promoting renewables, renovation, indoor environmental quality. It's also good to know that we have implemented good qualification and training schemes. We now have a lot of experts in different fields, so we have already had the chance to increase the knowledge in the overall energy sector. In terms of regulations of certification, huge impact we have had. Throughout the latest 10, 15 years, we had a huge increase in the energy performance requirements set up in legislation. Also, the implementation of the energy certification scheme, doing almost 18 years right now. And we also had quite an improvement in terms of innovation and sustainability. We see companies bringing much more innovative technologies, promoting relevant materials and construction solutions. The citizens and companies are well aware of the EPBD. We are trying to improve energy literacy, also bringing good awareness on the impact that arises from the EPBD at different levels and provide information. And of course, the real estate market has been quite impacted also on public policies. The energy performance is now a criteria for asset valuation, which is also impacting. The renovation and financial incentives go hand together, and we are also promoting a lot in terms of using databases. I would like to give you a quick glimpse on what you are doing with EPCs and the databases. So ADENE is managing the scheme since 2007. We have now over 2.5 million EPCs issued. I would say 3 million if we even consider the ones that have already expired. 40% of the building stock, a lot of public buildings and big non-residential also certified, and a lot of improvement measures are already identified. Gives us an idea of in terms of investment of savings we can get from these. And also the database. From the very beginning, it wasn't mandatory. Only now the EPBD makes it mandatory, but we implemented the EPC database, and we have been using this database in a lot of areas. I would highlight 3 topics: the support for the policymaking, or the incentivization of renovation actions, or the stakeholders. And with all this data, we have been able to support the policies, the monitoring, the design of financial schemes and identification of financial needs. Also to have the taxation, both at national and local level, based on the energy performance. We have seen buildings and homeowners reacting to the transaction prices when we have better buildings compared to the other ones that are inefficient, and also making link to one-stop shops. We are also supporting research and development and also providing data both for real estate agencies and local authorities. And 1 year ago, we have an opportunity also to establish a protocol with Portuguese Bank Association, where we share data that allow them not only to report, but also for us to receive data from the banks that allow us also to monitor better the long-term renovation strategy. In terms of planning for the EPBD 2024, I liked the final comment that Hélène made, which actually talks about the early start that we had. So we have been looking at the documentation even before the EPBD was published. And we also define a clear timeline in terms of engagement of stakeholders, the works we need to do, the consultations, the government discussion, and this has been important at the beginning. We managed to set up EPD working group, so the government with public entities. ADENE is coordinating the first phase, and we also have a dedicated working group for the national building renovation plans. In terms of stakeholder engagement, we are now counting 90 entities in 10 categories, and at ADENE we have actually put it all hands on deck. We have internally at the building department 12 thematic internal working groups that basically addresses, as you can see, most of the most relevant topics at the EPBD, and we are working on these topics and also providing some continuous monitoring of these groups so that we can deliver at the end. So as a final slide and challenges, I would say that this is indeed very complex. We have a lot of interaction and dependencies in many of the EPBD articles, as most of you are well aware. We are looking forward to see what this new standard, the zero emission building, will bring us. So it's not totally new. We're building up on the nearly zero energy buildings that we have now, but this fine tune will actually be the future standards, and the real estate is looking for it. For the Portuguese case, we are updating our calculation methodologies. This is an extra effort because we need to implement this new approach also to not only allow us for the future generation of EPCs, but also to align with MAPs, the National Building Renovation Plan, and etc. And this is another effort. We're also looking forward to see what the renovation passport will bring us. We will have to articulate very well this instrument with the energy performance certificate so that people actually knows what is the position and the role of these 2 instruments at the national level. And of course, I was not allowed to vote on the poll that we had initially, but I would pick on the global work potential as potentially the most impactive, as we will have the opportunity to look at the whole building sector in terms of life cycle, and this might be very demanding and challenge for the whole sector. We are still waiting for the final guidances from the Commission. This is an extra effort, although we are participating on the draft and following the draft documents. Only when it's finished, we can actually count with it in order to implement it and transpose. And the deadline, although it seemed quite a lot, 2 years, but this is also very demanding with all of these complex topics and also with the national building renovation plans on top. So it's quite of impacting ingredients, but we are looking forward and we are hopefully hoping to implement it, transpose, and so that the real estate market and all the stakeholders at the end see the benefits of implementing and having the EPBD on the ground. So thank you for this small opportunity to give an idea of what we are doing, and I'm happy to ask any comment and question that may come.
Rui, thank you very much for this quick overview about all the things which Portugal is already implementing and wants to implement. It sounds really like a big success story, what you have been doing and what you are still doing. I heard you saying that it also really drove, well, the change in how the construction sector supplied more innovative technologies, new technologies. So you really have evidence that the supply chain is delivering what it should deliver, and that it at the same time creates the benefits in terms of economic growth, job creation, and so on. So that's really happening, and you have evidence for that in Portugal?
Yes, it is. When we talk with the real estate market and we see the projects coming in, the nearly zero energy buildings is a standard that they incorporate, and it's typically on the front running of their promotion of the projects they are bringing. When we see solutions coming up, most of them talk about ZEB compliance or supporting the better sustainability. So all these topics, and sustainability is quite a very overarching topic, are on the jargon that the whole market is using at the moment. And this shows how they are committed with the EPBD, and not only the EPBD, but other policies that we have at national level. And this is driving a lot the construction, fortunately.
How did this commitment of the implementing agencies happen in Portugal? What led to that momentum?
Well, time. It took us a lot of time, actually. So this is something we have been building over 20 years, I would say. Now, since a lot of policies and aspects are pushing in the same direction, as for example, taxonomy is pushing for better reporting, and people want to have access to data, and banks, for example, so they want to have better assets and assets that comply with the taxonomy or nearly zero energy buildings and etc. So everybody's talking the same language. And I think it was time and engagement, not only from ADENE, but the stakeholders themselves and all the national entities that are also supporting this scheme. So as it has been a joint work over the 2 decades, I would say.
Thank you. Well, having the time also means that you started early and didn't drag your feet, which is great to see. So what Hélène also said in the closing of her presentation, we just have to get started. That's the most important thing to achieve the targets. And everybody speaking the same language definitely helps. So Rui, thank you very much for your presentation and your contribution. And with that, we are already approaching the end of our webinar. I'm very much aware that we could not answer all the questions you sent us in the Q&A box, but time is not unlimited in such a webinar. I think you will find many of the answers to the questions in the report itself. So please have a look there, download it, go through the various sections which you find most important, and please keep following us. Also, if you feel like sharing our report on your social media accounts, on your LinkedIn accounts, that would be wonderful. Thank you very much for doing that. And we will disseminate this recording of this webinar on our own social media channels. You now see the link to the LinkedIn account of BPIE in the chat. Thank you very much for joining us today, and I wish you a wonderful rest of the day wherever you are. All the best, and thank you. Till soon. Bye-bye.